be so shocked at how big their kitty is now.
They are going to be shocked at how big their kitty is. And you're going to be shocked, friends, about how great this video is. Because I'm going to respond to Erik Thor's interesting argument video. Erik Thor's.
Hey everyone, the name is Erik Thor. Today we are talking about argumentation, that process of butting heads with people around you to get things the way you want, or at least some kind of compromise. Yeah, argumentation has to do with direction, with management of resources, and yeah, people are to some extent the resource. So in this process you use one of four different styles to ensure that you get what you want. One of these styles is going to be one more comfort style. The style that you most naturally engage in, the style that gives you the most passion, power, and energy. So it's important to recognize that in this video. What do I enjoy the most? What style do I prefer? And what do I get the most out of? In this video, I will blow your mind. Yeah, that's right. So, I've identified is that there are two different styles of argumentation. First, there's the conclusive style, and then there's the argumentative style. Yeah, some people like to focus on the conclusion.
Okay, so, real quick. Focusing on the conclusion and making arguments to support it is not a different style of arguments than focusing on the arguments to derive the conclusion or to justify a conclusion. It's just from a motivational perspective within the individual, whether or not they're fully attached to their position statements. So if they're attached to a certain position statement, then they'll make arguments to support that position statement. And they may do so well or poorly. That's it. Right, but see, that's the same thing. You can't evaluate a verdict without doing that argumentation process, just as you can't critique the argumentation process without doing it yourself right now. You're making statements that make claims that therefore can and must be interacted with. One can interact with them in ways that are argumentationally effective or ineffective from a simple argumentation calculus standpoint. What are you pointing at? Huh? Why would you say it like that? No, because you're trying to find the right argument because the argument is the strongest argument, not to get the right conclusion or to convince people. Those are ancillary effects, incidental effects of arguing correctly. And arguing correctly means calculating correctly the respective strength of respective arguments in respective situations. Thinking and perceiving, he means. Or maybe he did mean thinking and stuff. Okay. Okay, so I agree with that, basically, that it often matters a great deal more how the argumentation, how a conclusion was reached than than what the conclusion is. But the problem is you're viewing it as an interaction between people. And what I'm saying is that's not good argumentation. It shouldn't be about people interacting with one another. It's an objective calculus of things. We wouldn't want a lab experiment to be about scientists engaging with one another. We want to try to remove the scientist from the equation so that it's as reliably unobserver shaped as possible to make it physically, in the physical world, effective in terms of falsification or something. All right, let's proceed. And so he's saying he wants to move towards a more ideal state. He doesn't necessarily want a particular incarnation of moving towards a more ideal state. And all right, so this is an interesting notion about arguments being distinct from operative statements. Operative statements being presumably commands, but he understands it's not just commands. He's saying if you have a set of TI conditional style rules that govern an organization, then that allows shit to get done in some regard. Whereas if you're merely making arguments, then they're not operative. They don't play a role as an object that furthers the interest of an enterprise. Okay, just to clarify what he's saying. Okay, so I'm assuming by feeling perceiving type here, he means INFJ who else was feeling or perceiving? I don't know. INFJ begins with a perceiving function. ENFP, who else is feeling and perceiving? ISFJ and I don't know. I can't remember. I'm trying to think of all because the terms here are confusing me. I'm getting mixed up in my head with whether they're MBTI calls them perceiving, or if it just means the FPs like ENFP, INFP, ESFP, ISFP. If it just means those four, then they aren't all perceiving types, really. So I don't know. That would seem to make what he's saying irrelevant then.
case of thinking and perceiving is swing. Thinking and perceiving is in so many ways about adapting an argument or about utilizing argument in situations, understanding what it means. Why does a person get angry? What makes the person go angry? What can I do to pass the situation? Thinking and perceiving is so much about responding to complex what people say, what people say.
That's FE and NI for him. He's talking about an FE NI kind of responsiveness.
Perceiving functions, perceiving the play styles are so much about the movements. It's about how do you identify at the end of the conclusion or a solution to that point. So it's something that's not making you perceive it, often making you perceive what I'm still on the system and idea. Because say this allows you should not keep thinking and perceiving, but they'll make it the different context. It will put it in a context like this person.
Alright, so he goes through a fair amount of explanation here. I'll skip over most of this explanation, or some of it anyway. But here's the answer to what he's saying is, he's talking about universalism and particularism. Okay, the universalist approach that is the objective approach, and it's the approach utilized by TI and FE. Okay, and NI and NE. And the particularist approach is used by the other four. Okay? So he's got it wrong with the functions. And he's making a lot of words to tell you that. Universalist is generalizable, but not precisely right to the situation. Particularist is precisely right to the situation, but not generalizable. Okay? And the thing is, to successfully argue well, one must acknowledge that there are certain circumstances in which particularism is appropriate, and there are certain circumstances in which universalism is appropriate. Almost all of the circumstances in our life, particularism ought be preferred. However, there are some circumstances in the world in which we ought prefer universalism, and those typically involve public policy. Let's continue. Play. It depends on. Okay, well, there's a fundamental misunderstanding of argumentation here. The argumentation he's using right now is talking about how people argue as though it were more art than science. It is a lot of art to it, I guess, but the reality is it's very much a science, and any type can learn to argue well, as I can attest, because as a debate coach, I've seen ENFPs become really good debaters, which means they've got effective TI in that one area anyway when it comes to arguing, which generalizes better than any other skill. So I don't know what he's getting at about this sub-conclusionary or I'm not sure where he's getting at. Okay. TI and FE are, like you're saying, objectified, and therefore across time out they work metaphysically. FI and TE foremost work real time or physically, and can be adapted out metaphysically. All functions do both in some regard. They engage in the physical or subjective experience, particularist, and they engage in the objectivist. But you're wrong by saying it correlates with, to the extent that what you're saying has any is right. It's not a correlation between perceiving and judging functions. It's a correlation between NI, NE, TI, FE, and SI, SE, TE, FI. So those are the sets, right? The objective ones, or the ones that are universalist, are not the judging functions. The ones that are objective are NI, NE, TI, and FE. So that I've explained in a number of different ways. But if anybody disagrees with that still, I've got the documents up there, and I've got videos where I go through the documents and check it out. I believe it's convincing. Hey! Pinpointing. You can't achieve that. It's not a thing to achieve in an argument, okay? Because, god damn it, fucking pause. That's not a thing to achieve. If you're using words, it's not distinct from the other stuff that you're talking about. If you're not using words, then it's not an argument. That's it. I like the music. I don't need to play any more of this video. But the point is, first of all, I like the video in general. I don't agree with his populations of thinking and perceiving and feeling and judging as being linked like that. I mean, it is true that the less prioritized in your stack TI is, the more likely you are to view logical argumentation as just another way of expressing your opinion or feeling, and not as determinate regarding the status of things, which in turn ought be determinate the operatives. So in other words, I don't end up talking a lot about the operative stage of things, but I do believe that if I were, for example, if I were a judge, I would immediately begin making operatives where it belongs to be made, namely public policy stuff. That's the issue here. We don't usually argue much about stuff that's personal to our lives. We'll either argue about ideas like philosophy or religion or stuff like that, or we'll argue about public policy, such as what the government should do. Or we'll argue about type, like what type Taylor is using a sphere. So, to argue is simply to consider multiple claims and determine which of those ought to be preferred and why. The why part is called the warrant. It's the reason. And the reason it matters is the impact. You can't get away from, you can't put argumentation in the box of cognition like that. Argumentation doesn't belong to cognitive functions. Cognitive functions are a fruit of argumentation. So the only reason the cognitive function model exists is because of argumentation. The only reason any good idea exists is because of argumentation. It is the ability of human beings both to establish it is the ability of humans to represent the actual reality in this metaphysical approximate reality in our mind, and it is the ability of humans to look forward in that approximation and say, well, if this approximation is approximately right, then probably it should look like this. That's called intuition. That's where good ideas come from. The fact that argumentation establishes what we ought to accept as true, and then intuition gleans new truths accordingly. One of my positions is that public policy is an area in which certain manners of attention ought to be paid according to the universalist and particularist metric that Erik Thor was talking about. My position is that we ought to prefer a universalist approach with public policy because, of course, public policy affects not just any particular person, but it affects everyone universally. In addition, we know that the making of public policy is always particularist. Namely, it's individual people who get together to make public policy. It's not one person necessarily, except for maybe it is the case with Russia or Donald Trump, in which case it's just some guy like me or you or somebody else, and maybe not even close to as competent as me or you or somebody else, who is attaining outcomes that are allowed because of our failure to adhere to a sense of decorum regarding where our respective talents lie and where our respective manners of attention ought to be directed. I don't mind when Trump's running a business and succeeding or going bankrupt or whatever. I do mind when he's making decisions of public policy. And the same thing with all that stuff. So at the end, Eric's like, hey, you got to remember, sometimes you're making bad arguments, a bad thing to do. Yeah, we're all making arguments all the time. That's all we're ever doing when we're talking. Unless you're just a straight up feeler and saying, I like sailing. I like the way the sun looks on the water. I like the way the sails look when the wind is blowing in them. Those are arguments that you can't rebut them because, no, you don't like that. You do not, you liar. It's kind of hard to win that argument. Anyway, people do have different argumentation styles. They have bad, slightly better, well, okay, and all the way up. It doesn't matter what your motivations are. That's the whole point of argumentation. It doesn't consider that. It excludes, as part of its approximation methodology, in other words, even though it makes it less absolutely correct, it makes it more universalizable and useful for us to exclude the observer's concerns and instead pretend as though we can interact with these objects in a disinterested fashion. Thus, because of that factor, argumentation is able to be determined conclusively like a chess match. Alright, don't forget to eat plenty of cheese. Your conclusion is not your belief. I don't care if you're satisfied that your conclusion has not withstood my lies. Not my lies, their lies. Or nobody's lying. But the point is, look, if there's a conclusion that you want to be true, if there's a statement that you want to be true, and you say, okay, well, you're arguing to win the argument, but what I'm saying is still true, blah, 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 blah. The reality is this. Things that are, when those kind of claims are withstand scrutiny, it's because it's the strongest argument. And if it's not the strongest argument, it doesn't withstand scrutiny and it falls apart. So, I mean, talking about claims that are, that determine what we ought to do, then we have to use this methodology of being fair, or else, to the extent that we don't, we necessarily reap injustice. That's simple. It's a long-ass video, but thanks for watching.